Hello, welcome back. We are in Deuteronomy chapter 24. So that means that we have 10 more chapters to finish Deuteronomy, and it's going to go pretty quick. As much as you're probably thinking, this has taken a long time. I'm okay with us stopping for a minute and acknowledging the fact that we've almost studied the whole Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. We even jumped over into Acts and did all of Acts to kind of bridge that gap. And with 10 chapters to go, you may be getting a little bit tired. You may be thinking, man, listening to this all the time is kind of boring. I'm sure nobody's saying that, but there might be somebody. I get it. It's heavy, it's hard, it's complex, it's confusing, but it's God's word. And if you only get some of it, it's still better than getting none of it. So keep trying, keep pushing, repeat these videos, repeat the readings, and go through it as many times as you have to, because we want to know what God wants us to know. And the only way to do that is to read his word. He wrote it down for us. And so we're now in chapter 24 of Deuteronomy. And I think we're going to do 24 and 25 together because they're fairly short. But these chapters, I've said a couple of times, Deuteronomy is the most quoted book in the New Testament. And most people don't know that because they've not read Deuteronomy, but we're going to read some stuff and you're going to see it. We're going to link to the New Testament too, but this is where it came from. So these stories that maybe you've heard for years, you're going to find out who they were quoting, why they were quoting Deuteronomy and Moses and his sermon on the mount in Moab. So let's jump right in. Suppose a man marries a woman, but she does not please him. Having discovered something wrong with her, he writes her a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away from his house. When she leaves his house, she is free to marry another man. But if the second husband also turns against her, writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away, or if he dies, the first husband may not marry her again, for she has been defiled. That would be detestable to the Lord. You must not bring guilt upon the land, and the Lord your God is giving you as a special possession. Now, I know you're probably thinking, I don't understand that. We're going to break it down. I promise it will all make sense. So let's hear. A newly married man must not be drafted into the army or be given any other official responsibilities. He must be free to spend 1 year at home, bringing happiness to the wife he has married. It is wrong to take a set of millstones, or even just the upper millstone, as security for a loan, for the owner uses it to make a living. If anyone kidnaps a fellow Israelite and treats him as a slave or sells him, the kidnapper must die. In this way, you will purge the evil from among you. In all cases involving serious skin disease, be careful to follow the instructions of the Levitical priest. Obey all the commands I have given them. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam as you were coming from Egypt. I like it in the complete Jewish version. We'll jump over there to verse 8. It says, when there's an outbreak of zerat, it doesn't say leprosy, it doesn't say skin disease, it says zerat. Be careful to observe and do just what the Kohanim, the priest, who are Levites, teach you. Take care to do as I ordered them. Remember what Adonai your God did to Miriam on the road after you left to Egypt. And it's important because Zerat was known as an inner or an outer, what is it called? A demonstration of your inner righteousness. So it was important that it be Zerat, not just some other kind of skin disease, because that meant it was a divine punishment from God. That's the only thing anybody thought about Zerat at the time. That's one of the reasons we changed it to leprosy, because then it just kind of made it seem like anybody that got leprosy was condemned by God, but that wasn't it. So let's keep going. If you lend anything to your neighbor, do not enter his house to pick up the item he is giving you as security. You must wait outside while he goes in and brings it out to you. If your neighbor is poor and gives you his cloak as security for a loan, do not keep the cloak overnight. Return the cloak to its owner by sunset so he can stay warm through the night and bless you, and the Lord your God will count you as righteous. Never take advantage of poor and destitute laborers, whether they are fellow Israelites or foreigners living in your town. Again, I like the complete Jewish Bible that says you are not to exploit a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether one of your brothers or a foreigner living in your land, because you're not supposed to take care of your employees, basically. You're supposed to pay them a fair wage and treat them right. Doesn't mean make them happy, doesn't mean, don't ever hurt their feelings. It means don't, torture them, don't beat them, and don't hold their wages. Pay them on time. Uh, Parents must not be put to death for the sins of their children, thank goodness, nor children for the sins of their parents, thank goodness. So those deserving to die must be put to death for their own crimes. This is some of that vertical retribution that we talked about in a previous chapter. True justice must be given to foreigners living among you and to orphans, and you must never accept a widow's garment as security for her debt. Always remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God redeemed you from your slavery. That is why I've given you this command. When you are harvesting your crops and forget to bring in a bundle of grain from your field, don't go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigners, orphans, and widows. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all you do. I learned this concept from a guy. He wasn't even a Christian, but when he would get change, he would throw it out in the parking lot or the sidewalk or whatever. And he said he just always felt like it was extra and he should give it to those in need. And I tried to tell him he was more of a Christian than he thought he was, but that's another story. So I do that now. I throw change. It drives my wife crazy, but I like to do it. So when you beat the olives from your olive trees, don't go over the boughs twice. Leave the remaining olives for the foreigners, orphans, and widows. When you gather the grapes in your vineyard, don't glean the vines after they are picked. Leave the remaining grapes for the foreigners, orphans, and widows. Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. That is why I'm giving you this command. Also remember they don't have the land yet. They don't have these big vineyards. They're like, why would we just ignore some of the grapes? Like, we don't have any grapes, and you're telling me I'm going to have too many that I can give it away. This is what we all face when God says, trust me in your finances. So you're telling me that I don't have to worry about every bit of it, that I can give it away and I'm still going to be okay? Yes, that's what God's telling us. That if we have faith, that no matter what our bank account says, he's still going to take care of us. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to have a bunch of money in your bank account. It means if he needs money in your bank account, you'll have it. If there's no money in your bank account, it means he didn't need you to have it. Now, work and do all those kind of things. Don't just count on God to magically put stuff in your bank account. That's not how it works. But I love that because you're talking to people who have nothing. They've been walking around in the desert for 40 years. Their parents died in the desert, and you're telling them they're going to have an abundance. So it's a very interesting chapter, I think. Well, let's get into it. So if a man decides to divorce his wife and she gets remarried to her new husband, or he dies or divorces her, she can't remarry her original husband. So what does that mean? Well, the idea was marrying and divorcing so a man could get his sexual needs met. And the Lord does not condone divorce. So what would happen is they would divorce their wife, go out, marry somebody else, have sex with them, divorce them, come back, marry their wife back. So rather than just go cheat on them for a weekend, they would actually marry them, sleep with them, divorce them, and come back. And God was saying, you're trying to get a technicality in the law, and that's not right. I hate divorce. Don't do it. Stop doing that. So Malachi 2:16 says, for I hate divorce, says Adonai, the God of Israel, and him who covers his clothing with violence, says Adonai Sebaot, which is Yahweh, God. Therefore, take heed to your spirit and don't break faith. So there's no objection to divorce and remarrying. The prohibition concerns getting married in the interim, like getting married in order to have sex and then doing something else. So that's why that part's important, because And we all do that. Well, technically, it's not a crime. It's like cussing in a church versus outside. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to say that in here. It's a technicality that you're trying to catch God on, and God's saying, no, there's no such thing as a technicality in God's law. He said it, that's what it is. Don't try to get around it. So the grain mill was essential because that's obviously what provided food. Uh, it had an upper and a lower millstone, and the principle is that it's morally wrong to take away their means of making a living, of eating and selling some of that bread. So it wouldn't be right to do that, do something different. I had a rental car one time, or my car was getting fixed, and they gave me another car. It was terrible, and I said, imagine if this was my work truck. My business would be shut down, and I wouldn't be able to work. And so they figured it out and got it done a lot faster. It wasn't my work truck, but the concept was there. Don't take away somebody's ability to work and earn a living and eat on a debt or whatever problem you're having. So in the Bible, kidnapping refers to taking someone to enslave them or selling them. And in war, you take over somebody, you'd take all the people and they would work for you, basically. So why do bad things happen to good people? We love to ask that question. Well, the answer to every why is a pattern. It's those patterns that are defined in the Torah, and we can't really know that without knowing Torah. The basis of all of these patterns is established there. So why would we know that if we don't study that? You and I are good. We're studying Torah. So the Hebrew word zerat does not mean leprosy. I know I keep repeating that, but here it is. The outward illustration of how the God sees our spiritual condition. Diseased and corrupt, unclean. So there was a point to it being zerat versus something else. When a Hebrew had zerat, they were separated. Not because it was contagious, but because they didn't want somebody who was unclean in the camp or near them. So earlier, Aaron and Miriam spoke against Moses, and she was struck with zerat. We studied that earlier in Genesis. Not just for everyone else to see, but so she could recognize her status in God's eyes. Sometimes a sinful condition can be ignored, and so it was shown to others. And sometimes, we have a friend. Hopefully, we have a close friend that says, "Hey, your spiritual condition seems a little off. You need to get back on track." And that's really what this served as, to say, "Hey, there's something wrong. Search yourself." So we were born outside the camp, outside the kingdom of God. So we were born in a state of inner defilement with zerat. That means that the blood of Messiah must cleanse us for us to be brought into the camp. So the water cleans us, makes us clean. Then we can be atoned for and come into the camp. So the next law is about collateral for a loan, which we talked a little bit. Return the coat, get it back by night, make sure they don't suffer just for a debt. The Hebrew word abote means pledge more than collateral. And it's ABOTE, and it's either a boat or a bote. I'm not positive. So if you know, give me a shout. Rebecca is the pledge. If we remember this story, in Genesis 24:31, it says, we get this question by Laban, "Why are you standing outside?" This corresponds to Deuteronomy 24:11, that the one who intends to collect a pledge must stand outside and not go into the house. The pledge must be brought out willingly and given to the master rather than him going in and get it. That was significant because it proved an intent, a heart there. So in a different sense, it is Isaac who is standing outside because he's standing outside of Mesopotamia. So where his wife-to-be was living at the time. So the pledge must come outside to Canaan. And Laban, the master of the house, offers Rebekah, and she is willingly escorted outside of Mesopotamia to Isaac in Canaan. So see that pattern we wouldn't know had we not studied that in Genesis, where it's coming from Deuteronomy now, and then we're going to see that same thing in the New Testament. So We find Isaac waiting in Canaan, and the Hebrew literally says it was before the going down of the sun when Isaac spotted the caravan. So in Hebrew culture, a wife was a man's garment. We've talked about that too. So a man wears his wife as a covering. So remember, the law in Deuteronomy was that it had to be done by sunset. This was done before the sun goes down. So the law says that clothing, the garment given as a pledge, which Rebecca was, she was considered a garment, a covering. Rebecca is the garment to be worn by Isaac as a covering. It was before sunset when Rebecca arrived. And so you wouldn't even see that if we didn't study it in Genesis and then in Deuteronomy and understand what all that meant. So he marries her, meaning he now wears his garment. Until we studied the law of pledges, that would have been impossible to see. So embedded in these stories are some really important God principles that you wouldn't see if you don't study the whole thing. So the parents may not be put to death for something the children did and vice versa. Always a good thing. So the difference between transgenerational punishment and vertical retribution is that vertical retribution is not part of the law code. Transgenerational punishment happens. Like you can punish the kids for the sins of the parents in the sense that they suffer the consequences of it. Vertical retribution is when God punishes them directly for the sins of the father or the son. So that's the difference in them. You can go back to listen to an earlier video on that if you want to. So it's carried out by God. It's his prerogative to decide in what situations to invoke vertical retribution or not. It's completely up to him. The law banning transgenerational punishment has to do with humans carrying out the justice system. So kids can suffer the consequences, but they can't be held legally liable for the offenses of the parents. That's what that means. So it's a little different thing. If a son committed a murder, the father doesn't owe his life, kind of thing. So Moses says that there is a reward for obedience. The Lord will bless you. The reason is that the farmer is giving up what is legitimately his for the sake of mercy. God's saying, you have to do this, but if you're obedient and do it in the heart as a hard issue for the reasons, he's even more pleased with you. So let's jump into chapter 25 and see a little legal dispute going on. So if people have, this is a complete Jewish Bible, I'll start there first. But if people have a dispute, seek its resolution in court, and the judges render a decision in favor of the righteous one and condemning the wicked one. Now, verse 1 in the New Living Translation. Suppose two people take a dispute to court, and the judges declare that one is right and the other is wrong. Well, it kind of takes some of the meaning out of it because remember, they're judging based on God's law, not American law, not Roman law, not any other kind of law. None of those existed. This is God's law. So if you are wrong in God's eyes against his law, you're evil. If you're not, you're righteous. That's how he words it. And when we take those words out of it, we kind of diminish the meaning of what's going on here. So let's jump into verse 2. We'll do the New Living Translation. I've heard from enough that it's a little easier to read or understand. So if the person in the wrong is sentenced to be flogged, the judge must command him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with the number of lashes appropriate for the crime. But never give more than 40 lashes. More than 40 lashes would publicly humiliate your neighbor. You must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain. If two brothers are living together on the same property and one of them dies without a son, his widow may not be married to anyone from outside the family. Instead, her husband's brother should marry her and have intercourse with her to fulfill the duties of a brother-in-law. The first son she bears to him will be considered the son of the dead brother, so that his name will not be forgotten in Israel. But if the man refuses to marry his brother's widow, she must go to the town gate and say to the elders assembled there, my husband's brother refuses to preserve his brother's name in Israel. He refuses to fulfill the duties of a brother-in-law by marrying me. The elders of the town will then summon him and talk with him. If he still refuses and says, I don't want to marry her, The widow must walk over to him in the presence of the elders, pull his sandal from his foot, and spit in his face. Then she must declare this is what happens to a man who refuses to provide his brother with children. Uh, so, verse 9 in the Complete Jewish Bible says this. Then his brother's widow is to approach him in the presence of the leaders, pull his sandal off his foot, spit in his face, and say, this is what is to be done to the man who refuses to build up his brother's family. So she's saying this is a law. You're supposed to do this. So this is disrespectful and humiliating. Plus, she doesn't really spit on his face as much as she spits on his foot. We'll get into that in a minute. We covered this in an earlier chapter when basically the same thing happened, and we'll get into all of that, I promise. So, even afterward in Israel, his family will be referred to as the family of the man whose sandal was pulled off. If the two Israelite men get into a fight and the wife, if two, not these two, but if two get into a fight and the wife of one tries to rescue her husband by grabbing the testicles of the other man, you must cut off her hand. Show her no pity. You must use accurate scales when you weigh out merchandise, and you must use full and honest measures. Yes, always use honest weights and measures so that you may enjoy a long life in the land the Lord your God is giving you. All who cheat with dishonest weights and measures are detestable to the Lord your God. Never forget what the Amalekites did to you as you came from Egypt. They attacked you when you were exhausted and weary, and they struck down those who were straggling behind. They had no fear of God. Therefore, when the Lord your God had given you rest from all your enemies in the land he is giving you as a special possession, you must destroy the Amalekites and erase their memory from under heaven. Never forget this. So, I know that's a lot, but let's break it down here. So men have a legal dispute. So courts convene, that's investigated, and a judge hears the case. The one that's judged wrong is flogged. That's pretty easy to understand. But the part about, not too much, a person punished too much becomes bitter. And then they become cynical and they become worse most of the time. So this principle is repeated in Ephesians 6:4 that says, fathers, don't irritate your children and make them resentful. Instead, raise them with the Lord's kind of discipline and guidance. So that's repeated. And again, like I said, most quoted book in the Bible, because all these principles are kind of expanded and taught. And Moses was the most important person to a Jew they had ever met, or heard of. So oxen are grazers. They like to wander around and eat the grass. So it's their nature to eat during the process of walking and milling grain and threshing wheat and stuff. So this law says productivity basically matters less than the ox, so don't muzzle it. Let it eat, and don't be cruel and take away the thing that it does the most. Got to be nice to animals too. He cares about animals. So this principle is brought forward in 1 Corinthians 9, 1 through 14. Paul quotes Deuteronomy 25:4 in his response to supporting the apostles and the disciples. He says this, for the law of Moses says, you must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain. Was God thinking only about oxen when he said this? Wasn't he actually speaking to us? Yes, it was written for us so that the one who plows and the one who threshes the grain might both expect a share of the harvest. Because understand, he's making all of this. Why shouldn't he get to eat any of it? Well, Paul is saying, hey, if we help build all of this, shouldn't we benefit from it somehow? Since we have planted spiritual seed among you, aren't we entitled to a harvest of physical food and drink? If you support others who preach to you, shouldn't we have an even greater right to be supported? But we have never used this right. We would rather put up with anything that can be an obstacle to the good news about Christ. Don't you realize that those who work in the temple get their meals from the offerings brought to the temple? And those who serve at the altar get a share of the sacrificial offerings, which we wouldn't have known had we not read the Torah. So in the same way, the Lord ordered that those who preach the good news should be supported by those who benefit from it. So any creature that is productive should enjoy the fruits of labor. That's what God's saying. So beginning in verse 5 is what we call the Levirate marriage. A man dies, leaves no son, so the widow is obligated to marry within the husband's family. The husband's supposed to go make her a son, and that firstborn son from that would be considered uh, the deceased man's son. So the purpose was to keep a man's name alive and to prevent the widow or his property from being passed to relatives and his widow not being taken care of. So there's a superstition involved, though. By preserving a person's name, his spirit would remain. That was the belief. So this is why we have tombstones and markers, because this was the beginning of that. If we keep their name out, their spirit survives. Now, this is where I get in trouble, and people say, "Well, Brandon's against tombstones." Yeah, I am. Only because I know, I get it. I know they're important to a lot of people, but when it's done for the wrong reasons, whether it's a cross, a fish, a prayer, a communion offering, whatever it is, it's wrong. So think through that. That's all I'm saying. Don't go knocking down tombstones. That's definitely not what I'm telling you to do. So uh, let's see. Fast forward a few centuries to Ruth. Ruth's husband had no living brothers, so it fell to distant relatives to give her a son. And what if the brother does not want to marry the widow? The widow brings him to the city gates and declares that he refused to do his duty. So this was humiliating for him too. So because sexuality was at the front of most of these ancient cultures, they all lived in tents, they all lived beside each other. Privacy was not a thing. In Hebrew thought, a man marries a woman and puts on his wife as clothing. So she becomes a covering for him, and he provides a covering for her. The sandal represents the woman's reproductive organ, and the man's foot represents his reproductive organ. So the man, according to the Levirate marriage rules, is supposed to wear the woman's reproductive organ, but he won't. So the woman removes the sandal from his foot, and that's publicly humiliating. Uh, like I said, most versions say she spit in his face, but she mainly spit in his presence. The spit represents his semen. I know things in the Bible are not all rosy, easy things to talk about either. But the reason this is important because it sets the pattern in place. But remember, when you think, well, what's that? Why is that the reproductive organ? Well, if you look at the hand and you think about, we have one finger that's taller than all the others. It's the middle one. And for some reason, we've deemed that to be offensive. I don't know why, but that's what we did, and now it's offensive. So, but this story, it reenacts the story of Onan and Tamar in Genesis 38, where Onan would not place his seed in Tamar, but elected to spill it on the ground. So that's where this came from. In Matthew 22:23 through 32, it says this. Sorry. That same day, Jesus was, let me be sure I'm in the right place, 23 through 32. Okay, yeah. It's actually 23 through 32. So that same day, Jesus was approached by some Sadducees, religious leaders who say there is no resurrection from the dead. They posed this question: Teacher, Moses said if a man dies without children, his brother should marry the widow and have a child who will carry the brother's name. Well, suppose there were 7 brothers. The oldest one married, then died without children, so his brother married the widow. But the second brother also died, and the third brother married her. This continued with all 7 of them. Last of all, the woman also died. So tell us, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? For all 7 were married to her. You may not have even known that story goes back to Deuteronomy. But Jesus replied, your mistake is that you don't know the scriptures and you don't know the power of God. For when the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. In this respect, they will be like angels in heaven. But now, and that's one of the reasons we think when we die, we become angels, but we don't. But now, as to whether there will be a resurrection of the dead, haven't you ever read about this in scriptures? Long after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died, God said, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So he is the God of the living, not the dead. So Jesus says that this is pointless because it won't matter in heaven. A world more spiritual than physical. So providing a deceased man with a son would have no meaning. Reproduction, sexual, fertility has no meaning in heaven. So the need for marriage is not there. That was the reason you got married, was to reproduce. So there will be no need to produce a child because you're in heaven now. So if the wife decides to help, this law says cut off her hand. The fight where she grabs. Uh, the Torah reflects God's view of bodily mutilation. Now remember, she's grabbing a man's genitals, and it's destructive and it's humiliating. So God says cut her hand off so she learns not to do that. Now remember, one of the goals of some of God's laws is prevention. So it's like, if I know I'm going to get my hand cut off, I'm probably not intervening in a fight. So he's trying to teach that lesson more than the punishment side of it. So verse 13 is really about the law of improper intervention and the law of weights and measures. This all goes together. So it's a double entendre, as they say. It blends two thoughts, and the words have parallel meanings. So in verse 12, the issue is male genitalia, and immediately following, it's about weights in a pouch, or literally stones in a pouch, because that's what they used for weight. So then in verse 14, it speaks of not having larger or smaller weights, which connects to verse 13 about having a large and a small stone in your pouch. So both laws come down to fairness, and the stones and pouch show the connection between the law of improper intervention and the use of weights to cheat someone. So then 25:17 says, never forget what the Amalekites did to you as you came from Egypt. So God says, never forget that they behaved as cowards without honor, attacking the weak and the elderly. In other words, what they did was cheating. So he's setting that pattern, using analogies to teach that. And remember, the Amalekites attacked the rear, the handicapped, the older, the slower. That's why he calls them cowards. King Saul, about 250 years later, was given the order to attack Amalekite. In 1 Samuel 15, I'll let you read that, but Saul set up an ambush and he almost succeeded. Agag was captured, but he was spared. And so this angered God so much he regretted making Saul king. And the prophet Samuel told Saul that he disobeyed God. Saul argued, but in the end he admitted he had sinned, and Samuel executes Agag. So Jehovah compares the sin of Saul with the sins of sorcery and idolatry, sins that call for the death sentence. So God will now separate from him the ultimate death sentence. So the reason idolatry is so much bigger than a little statue, it's because whenever God tells you to do something and you do it your way versus his way because you saw better, that's idolatry, because now we've created a God that doesn't exist. So King Saul decided to do things a little bit God's way and a little bit his way, and God wasn't okay with that. So one of the sayings of Yeshua is to love our enemies. We're not to love his enemies who oppose the kingdom of God. Amalek was God's enemy. Satan and his followers are another. So when we hear Jesus say, well, love your enemies, that doesn't mean love God's enemies. That means love yours, because your enemies are probably not God enemies. And you won't know that if you don't read the Word of God. So that's why it's important. That's where a lot of Muslims and people that go into these, I'm killing for God, it's a holy war or intifada or whatever it is. No, that's not a thing. God's enemies are clearly mapped out, and he's not going to put you in charge of going and taking one of them out. That's why we need advisors too. So, and don't do it our own way. Make sure it's God's way. So that is chapter 24 and 25. I hope that was made sense. If not, send me your questions, comments, thoughts, whatever you want to talk about, and we'll talk about it. God bless. Love God, love people, and change the world.